If I had to choose between getting shot or burned by a flamethrower, I'd take the bullet every time. These words from a World War II Pacific veteran capture why flamethrowers struck terror into the hearts of even the most hardened soldiers. While bullets might kill you instantly, flamethrowers promised something far worse: a slow, agonizing death with no escape. A weapon so horrifying that soldiers would rather face machine gun fire than its unstoppable inferno. Today, we're exploring why flamethrowers became the most psychologically devastating weapon on the battlefield. What sound made soldiers freeze with terror in the trenches of World War I? It wasn't artillery or machine gun fire. It was the distinctive whoosh of a flamethrower igniting. In an instant, that sound transformed even hardened veterans into panic-stricken men, desperate to escape. Unlike bullets or shells that killed from a distance, flamethrowers tapped into something much more primal: our evolutionary fear of fire. Military psychologists who studied battlefield behaviors discovered something remarkable. Soldiers would rather face almost any conventional weapon than see a flamethrower unit approaching their position. This wasn't just ordinary fear, it was pure, instinctive terror. A German war diary from 1917 described how British troops abandoned a heavily fortified position on the Western Front when just 2 Flammenwerfer operators appeared. The British had withstood days of artillery bombardment without breaking, yet fled within minutes once flames appeared on the battlefield. German Lieutenant Ernst Junger wrote in his memoirs how enemies would lose all composure at the mere sight of flame units. "We noticed they would stand their ground against machine guns and artillery," he noted, "but the moment our flame units appeared, they would retreat in complete disorder, abandoning otherwise impregnable positions." Military strategists quickly recognized the psychological advantage and exploited it mercilessly. By 1918, both German and Allied commanders were deploying flamethrowers primarily for their killing efficiency. They were using them as weapons of terror designed specifically to break enemy morale. Flame units would often be sent forward not to secure objectives, but to create panic that conventional forces could then exploit. Perhaps the most telling evidence of flamethrowers' psychological impact came during the Pacific Campaign of World War II. Japanese soldiers, famous for their unyielding death before surrender code, sometimes made a remarkable exception when facing American flamethrower units. Marine veteran Eugene Sledge recounted in his memoir how his unit captured several Japanese soldiers who surrendered after seeing M2 flamethrowers being prepared, behavior that contradicted their typical fight-to-the-death doctrine. The terror extended far beyond the actual effective range of the weapons. While early World War I flamethrowers could only project flame about 20 yards, their psychological effect created what military analysts called a terror radius, extending up to 100 yards or more. Soldiers would abandon positions well outside the actual range of the flames, simply because the visual and auditory signature triggered such profound fear responses. The outsized psychological impact was partly rooted in soldiers' awareness of the horrific medical realities that awaited flamethrower victims. Unlike a bullet wound that might kill instantly, flamethrower attacks promised something far worse. Field reports from medical units detailed how soldiers hit by flamethrowers would often remain conscious as their skin and tissue burned, creating some of the most nightmarish battlefield injuries doctors ever witnessed. What made flamethrowers uniquely terrifying was the simple understanding among troops: if you were hit directly, your chances of survival were virtually zero. A British field hospital report from 1918 stated that of 38 soldiers admitted with significant flamethrower burns, only 3 survived the first week, and all 3 died within a month from infection and organ failure. The Japanese called American flamethrowers the weapon that eats life. Behind the terrifying statistics of flamethrower casualties lay a medical nightmare unlike anything seen in warfare before. While a bullet might kill instantly, these weapons did something far worse. They created wounds that defied conventional treatment. Military flamethrowers didn't just produce ordinary burns. They delivered a unique form of agony that medical science of the 1940s had no real answer for. The specialized fuel mixtures used in military flamethrowers were designed specifically to cling to whatever they touched. Unlike regular fire that might be extinguished with water, these jellied petroleum compounds, early versions of what would later be called napalm, adhered to skin like a second layer. Field medics reported that attempts to extinguish these flames with water often made the situation worse, as the burning fuel would afloat on the water's surface and spread to previously unaffected areas of the body. The extreme temperatures produced by military flamethrowers, reaching up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, created thermal injuries that penetrated far deeper than conventional burns. According to a 1944 medical report from the Pacific Theater, the intense heat carbonized the outer layers of skin while simultaneously cooking underlying muscle tissue and organs. One Army surgeon described how the distinction between 3rd and 4th degree burns became meaningless when treating flamethrower victims, as the damage often extended all the way to the bone. What made these injuries particularly insidious was their tendency to progress long after the initial attack. The chemical composition of the fuel continued reacting with body tissues for hours. A field hospital nurse in the Pacific wrote that victims who initially appeared to have survivable burns would suddenly deteriorate 6 to 8 hours later as deeper tissues began to necrotize. This progressive tissue death created a unique challenge for medical personnel who had no precedent for treating such evolving wounds. Perhaps most horrific were the respiratory injuries. When a soldier was caught in a flamethrower blast, they inevitably inhaled superheated air and toxic chemical fumes. A 1945 Naval Medical Journal documented that these inhalation injuries often proved fatal, even when external burns appeared survivable. The superheated gases would scorch the delicate tissues of the throat and lungs, causing rapid swelling that led to suffocation within hours. Those who survived this initial phase often developed chemical pneumonia in the days that followed, with mortality rates exceeding 90%. The rare survivors faced unimaginable challenges. A study of 54 Pacific Theater veterans with significant flamethrower injuries showed that they required an average of 17 separate surgeries over 3 years. The burn scars contracted as they healed, permanently restricting movement and causing excruciating pain. A military psychiatrist noted in 1947 that these survivors exhibited psychological trauma distinct from other combat injuries, characterized by persistent nightmares, specifically about burning, and an unusual fear of open flames that persisted decades after their injuries. The medical establishment's inability to effectively treat these wounds created its own form of psychological horror among combat medics. A MASH unit doctor in Korea wrote that treating a man hit by a flamethrower meant watching him die slowly while providing only the illusion of care. The limitations of mid-20th century burn treatment meant that even minor flamethrower injuries had mortality rates 3 to 4 times higher than comparable conventional burns. The very weapon that created such untreatable suffering became, paradoxically, the salvation of thousands of American lives. When Marines landed on Iwo Jima in February 1945, they faced an engineering marvel that would redefine modern warfare, an island transformed into a fortress. Japanese defenders had spent years converting the volcanic terrain into a honeycomb of interconnected bunkers, pillboxes, and underground positions. This defensive network rendered traditional military tactics not just ineffective, but suicidal. 3 days of naval bombardment, over 8,000 tons of explosives, had barely scratched the surface of these defenses. American commanders watched in horror as their men were cut down in waves while attempting to neutralize positions with grenades and rifles. The concrete bunkers, some with walls 6 feet thick, laughed off conventional explosives. Even direct hits from 500-pound bombs often left Japanese defenders unharmed and ready to continue fighting. The tactical situation called for something that could reach into these fortifications and eliminate defenders without requiring American troops to physically enter the death traps. The M2 flamethrower emerged as the unlikely hero of this impossible scenario. Its 65-foot range meant operators could project streams of burning fuel into ventilation shafts, doorways, and gun ports from relatively protected positions. What conventional explosives couldn't accomplish in days, a flamethrower team could achieve in seconds. One man with a flamethrower is worth 50 with rifles when tackling these concrete positions, wrote Lieutenant Colonel William McMillan after observing operations on Iwo Jima. The mathematics was brutally simple. Either sacrifice hundreds of infantry attempting to clear bunkers with grenades and submachine guns, or deploy specialized flamethrower teams that could neutralize the same position with vastly fewer American casualties. This effectiveness came at a terrible cost for those who carried the weapons. The distinctive silhouette of the M2, a soldier wearing twin fuel tanks on his back, made operators priority targets for Japanese snipers. The 70-pound apparatus significantly reduced mobility, turning operators into slow-moving targets. Field reports indicated flamethrower operators had an average combat life expectancy of just 8 minutes during intense engagements. Despite constituting less than 2% of frontline personnel, they suffered nearly 25% of all casualties in some Pacific engagements. Military engineers sought to address this vulnerability by developing tank-mounted flamethrowers. The M4A3R3, nicknamed the Zippo or Ronson tank by troops, could project flame up to 150 yards, more than twice the range of portable units. These armored flamethrowers could approach hardened positions under protection and deliver devastating firepower. On Okinawa, a single company of Sherman Zippo tanks neutralized 97 fortified positions in a single day, accomplishing what would have required multiple infantry battalions. Operation statistics from Iwo Jima revealed the stark efficiency of these weapons. When conventional infantry tactics were employed, American forces suffered an average of 22 casualties per fortified position cleared. When flamethrower teams led assaults, this figure dropped to approximately 5 casualties per position. The 5th Marine Division reported that incorporating flamethrower teams into their standard operating procedure reduced overall casualties by 65% when facing fortified areas. The cruel irony of the Pacific Campaign became clear. The weapon most dreaded by individual soldiers saved more American lives than perhaps any other infantry tool. Military planners calculated that without flamethrowers, taking islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa might have cost an additional 25,000 to 30,000 American casualties. The shadow of the flamethrower still burns in modern military consciousness. After Vietnam, international sentiment turned sharply against these weapons, culminating in Protocol 3 of the 1980 Geneva Convention, which prohibited their use against civilian populations. Though technically not banned in combat against military targets, most armies have quietly retired them from active service. The psychological wounds inflicted by flamethrowers extend beyond their victims. Many operators suffer severe PTSD, with one former Marine flamethrower specialist noting, "I didn't just kill men, I erased them." Today's military planners face the same ethical calculations. When does tactical advantage cross into unnecessary cruelty? From white phosphorus to thermobaric weapons, Modern arsenals continue this grim tradition of weaponizing our primal fears. If you are fascinated by the psychological dimensions of warfare, subscribe to see our upcoming video on the weapons that contemporary military psychologists rank as most terrifying in modern combat.